Hello. With me today is Professor Philip Goodchild, who is the Professor of Religion and Philosophy here in the University of Nottingham. One of Philip's research interests is how money and theology can be interconnected. So the question I'm putting to him today is, why study money and theology?
Well, at first sight, you might think that money and theology are at opposite poles of human experience.
I would indeed.
Don't really relate to each other very much. We have this narrative that's widely accepted about modern life, that we construct the modern world out of science and reason and evidence, and that there's not really a place for belief anymore. If there is, it's just a private matter. But the way in which we organise our cooperation with each other tends to be through money. And by that, I don't mean it's that we're all greedy or we're all pursuing wealth like mad. It's just a way of regulating human behaviour and keeping it balanced, keeping it just, paying money to each other. Now, money is a belief system. Money is nothing more than a belief. A note is a promise. There's a promise made by a central bank. And most money that exists in the form of promises, but actually as electronic records of promises. And it's been created by banks when people take out loans. Because banks, as we know, lend in excess of their reserves. So a lot of the money that they lend, they don't have, and they don't actually pay it out, except perhaps they transfer it to another bank that's doing exactly the same. So they lend money that is actually a promise, and it works as a two-way promise. The bank promises to pay up that value, but the people who take out a loan also promise to pay it back at some stage. And this means that we have a society that runs effectively on promises and on the promises of others. And so we have a society that's a collective belief system, and the belief in the value of money is a kind of theology in a way.
When you use the word theology there, that's a very different use of the word theology from something like faith-seeking understanding. So when you use the word theology, what do you mean by it?
When people use money, they don't usually seek to understand it. They know what it is, know what it does for all practical purposes, and don't need to think about it. This is quite different from normal kind of studies of theology where there's already a faith, but it's a faith that needs to be made explicit, that's seeking an understanding, that seeks to develop what it's fully all about. Where my work, I think, differs from most economic accounts of money is that I do seek understanding and understand money and not simply what it's used for, the commerce that takes place through it. Understand money as a set of obligations, a set of promises that people enter into, and as the basis of trust and confidence through which we can interact and cooperate.
If that's the case, how do you see the current banking crisis, where every day we're hearing about the problems of the Greek bank, the problems of the euro, the problems of American credit being downgraded? Is this the equivalent of a crisis of faith?
Absolutely. It's certainly a crisis of confidence. The way the money system works is that there's not enough. It's one thing to produce goods and services, but you also, in order for them to be distributed, you have to produce money, and you have to have enough money circulating. And the more the economy grows, the more you need additional money. So you need additional loans, additional debts. Now, in recent economic history, we have this marvelous separation out of the roles where a lot of the production takes place in the Far East and a lot of the consumption, but also the borrowing takes place in the West. And as it were, the the West has borrowed into existence the money that then creates the demand for all the goods that are produced in the Far East. And it's a system that partly balances out but partly doesn't, because in the West there's always a balance of payments deficit, there's always this debt, and the trouble is once debt's created, the money to pay it back has to come from somewhere else. So someone else has to pay out, has to take on a debt in order for other people to pay off their debts. And this leads to a complicated position whereby once debt gets beyond a certain level where people think it's too great, they don't have confidence in it anymore, you need a debtor of last resort to come in and say, we have the confidence in ourselves and the confidence in you, we can bail you out, we can lend you the money. And what happened in 2007, 2008 was the banks who'd been taking out huge amounts of leverage lost confidence in each other, and they needed the states and central banks to step in to provide extra confidence in the markets to keep the credit system going. But the trouble is, now our sovereign states have weakened their own position because they've taken on very significant debts. And the markets in turn are thinking, well, can we trust the sovereign states? So we have this no-win position. The only way out would be to either rediscover economic growth through a new source of confidence, perhaps a new kind of technology, a new sources of energy, something that comes from outside and completely transforms the system. Or else we have this negative downward spiral of loss of confidence, which means that any currency where there's a large amount of debt will suffer from either inflation, or people will be falling into default, or there'll be a devaluation of that currency. Or you could get a reduction in the goods and services produced, a big reduction in the overall size of the global economy, and you get inflation and deflation almost at the same time.
One of the word law is thrown around, and you take a thing like the law of gravity. Well, the law of gravity means that I know I can't walk out the window on the first floor without doing myself damage. And I have a great deal of confidence that as long as I'm on this planet, this law will always apply. But many other things that come under the realm of law are actually merely just utterly conventional. They're agreements. When people talk about economic laws and the forces of the marketplace, is it better to see these almost like dogmatic definitions within a religious system than something equivalent to laws like gravity?
I suppose I would see them very often as ideologies. For example, people might talk about the law of comparative advantage as though it's like the law of gravity and always applies. But it might be a principle that different countries are better at doing different things and will be better served if they do their different things. But that doesn't mean to say at all times and in all places, in every case, it's best to keep to what you're good at and not do a full range of other things. So it's one thing to take a principle or talk about a tendency or say, in general, there is this economic force or economic phenomenon. It's another thing to analyse how that has a bearing on each specific concrete situation and what other forces are at work. In general, I would say that most economic laws are simply tendencies, but they become ideological when people call them laws, and they become belief systems that they live by and reconstruct their lives by. So the idea that markets are efficient is one that structured a lot of economic behaviour over the past decades.
There's a phrase that's used, let's get to the bottom line. And it's almost like this is ultimate reality. And there seems to be nothing more real than the cash in your pocket. It has the same quality as the floor we're sitting on. What's the advantage of seeing money not as the bottom line and not as real as the floor? Does it somehow liberate us? Does it help us to live, to see money in terms of ideology?
Well, yes, money is a kind of collective belief, and so all these sovereign debts they're part of a game, really. It's just we all believe in the value of money. We believe in the value of these coins, but they're just lumps of metal. We believe in these things, these electronic records that banks have, and all the red figures that are there, but they're just invented red figures. They're a certain way of playing the game. They're a certain system. The advantage is if the system breaks down significantly and deeply, as I believe it has done now, if we recognise it's just a game, then perhaps we can invent another game or try another game. We can look for a different way of interacting, a different way of regulating our behaviour that is a little bit more resilient, that is a bit more inspiring of confidence, that isn't going to let us down in the same kind of way. So different kinds of money systems can be invented and can be used and are very much needed. And I think ultimately it's a theological question. What is really worth putting your faith in? We have to put our faith somewhere. So what can we put our faith in that gives us a basis for confidence in each other? That's a profoundly theological question.
Philip, thank you very much.